It's Bell Logic Knowledge. Come get your scholarship. As a CEO of Bell Logic Knowledge, LLC, I am an African-centered scholar that assists in research. Happy Juneteenth. In the debut teaching, we will learn about Juneteenth and the importance of education for our community to navigate and thrive in and secure our freedom in a white supremacy society. What is Juneteenth and why is it important? Elizabeth Nick's article entitled What is Juneteenth, found on History.com, presents an overview of Juneteenth. Juneteenth commemorates the effective end of slavery in the United States. It marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people be freed. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth honors the end of slavery in the United States and is considered the longest-running African-American holiday. With an overview of Juneteenth covered, it is now time to present to you Bell Logic Knowledge debut lesson on African-centered research on your conscious journey and why education is so important. I present the following resources and the thought process to support African-centered and culturally relevant education. This display outlines how the ideology of race and slavery evolved from physical slavery to mental slavery, and a modern-day analysis of how we free our minds through knowledge of self. Let's begin. All right, let's begin. So, to begin our journey, we must first understand the thought process that even constructed our society. So I start you with Race in North America, Origin and Evolution of a Worldview by R.G. Smedley and Brian D. Smedley, essentially presenting the ideology and rationale to control our physical bodies and organize society. Now, in America, and specifically for this day, we celebrate Juneteenth, which occurred in 1865, the freeing of our bodies. Now, we have resources that track how slavery of the body evolved to mental slavery through education and curriculum in our schools. We can start with the following: The White Architects of Black Education, Ideology, and Power in America, 1865 to 1954, tracking how industrial education became the platform for how to control our now freed African bodies. Then we also have The Education of Blacks in the South from 1860 to 1935 by James D. Anderson, and Indians at the Hampton Institute, 1877 to 1923, because these two resources essentially detail how the schools were constructed specifically to teach the minds how to still play within a slavery subordinate dominant dynamic. Next, I present to you the following resources. These focus on the psychology of African Americans/Black people in the system of white supremacy in the United States. You have the Developmental Psychology of the Black Child by Amos N. Wilson, who essentially tracks how the Black child develops from in the womb to birth all the way to adulthood. Then we have The Miseducation of the Negro, that is Carter G. Woodson's famous study of how our system of education has miseducated us to thinking that the higher we go in our education, if we go on our solo routes without our people, it is in fact how slavery repeats itself when we do not share the education in which we gain. Which is why Bell Logic Knowledge LLC is here to share that education and connect that dynamic of research, the experiences, and how we can overcome these conflicting narratives that we experience. The conflicting narratives that we experience as Black people in America is found in The Souls of Black Folk, Essay and Sketches by W.E.B. Du Bois. Can't find my book, but it's a very important resource. It essentially details how we have double vision, that we have to work within understanding Black culture and navigating that way, but also understanding white culture and navigating that way, and how we utilize both of our visions to essentially survive in America. And then in conclusion, I present to you Bell Logic Knowledge LLC's Modern Study of Mental Slavery in Education. This is the foundational piece of of Biologic Knowledge, LLC, because it is a master thesis completed in 2019 entitled Critical Race Theory in Education, analyzing African American students' experience with epistemological racism and Eurocentric curriculum. Essentially, epistemological racism is racial ideology of the beginning plus white curriculum control and narratives that equals mental slavery. All of the resources of today essentially bring you to this document. And in this document, I present how critical race theory and curriculum and community control of curriculum equals knowledge of self. Knowledge of self heals mental slavery, unites our community, and strengthens our growth and liberation from a white supremacist society. Now I present to you a brief reading of Critical Race Theory in Education, analyzing African American students' experience with epistemological racism and Eurocentric curriculum. The foundational workpiece of Biologic Knowledge, LLC's Research and Publication Service. This literature review presents an analysis of race ideology within U.S. society and in schools in order to understand how such ideologies are transmitted to African American students through Eurocentric curriculum and thus can perpetuate racism. Recognizing that American curricula originates from social control elements and that schools are institutions responsible for preparing students for the world they live in, I focus on African American students' experience with a Eurocentric curriculum and how this curriculum influences their social identity and ability to successfully navigate society. Essentially, the literature review I am positing emphasizes curricular influence on student interactions with and within society. With literature from several disciplines, I review scholarship using critical race theory in education as a conceptual, methodological, and theoretical framework to answer the following questions. How does white supremacy ideology intersect with Eurocentric curriculum? How does the intersection of epistemological racism affect the psyche of African American students? And how can critical race theory in education and critical pedagogy aid African American students in comprehending their social identity and their interactions in and understanding of society? The purpose of this literature review is to gain a better understanding of racial ideologies within U.S. Eurocentric curriculum and how this curriculum perpetuates the existing status quo by influencing African American students' interactions in and understanding of U.S. society. Eurocentric curriculum is defined as a curricular narrative that utilizes the social history and understanding of the dominant white race to communicate and sustain white construction of society. The focus is on the complex and contextual comprehension of ideology, race, ethnicity, the school, society, and curriculum, as well as how these ideologies and institutions intersect to create and foster intellectual disadvantages and the lack of self-knowledge among African American students, families, and communities. This review of literature provides a foundation for future research into schools' involvement with epistemological racism, as well as analyzing how political institutions such as schools and educational policies and practices affect racial identities, and political ideologies. As an interdisciplinary analysis, this literature review includes the following academic disciplines: African and Black Diaspora Studies, Education, History, Law, Philosophy, Political Science, Psychology, and Sociology, to emphasize the socio-historical intersection of white supremacy ideology, curriculum, and public education that sustains U.S. society. This review also acknowledges and emphasizes the responsibility of American schools to prepare students for society, connecting curriculum to students' views about the world, their racial identity, and their racialized social interactions, presenting a racial analysis of Eurocentric curriculum and how this curriculum sustains multiple forms of racism: cultural, individual, interpersonal, institutional, structural, and systemic. The underlying premise that guides this review emphasizes that U.S. public education historically sought social control to create a united American identity, sustain a white supremacist economic social order, and distribute social cultural capital and expectations. Therefore, I use critical race theory in education to investigate white supremacy ideology within U.S. public curricula and use narratives as counter storytelling to communicate students of color, specifically African American students, experience with Eurocentric curriculum. While I recognize the heterogeneousness of African American experience in education across social and economic status, I focus on the social impact all African American students endure with Eurocentric curricula that encapsulate U.S. public education. In what follows, I answer the first question: how does white supremacy ideology intersect with Eurocentric curriculum, arguing that education and society have a complex dialectical relationship that distributes white supremacy ideology through Eurocentric curriculum to sustain the social-historical intersection of white supremacy ideology and curriculum, maintaining slaveocracy relations between African American and white people in the U.S. through epistemological racism. In short, the intersection of white supremacy ideology and curriculum is epistemological racism. Then in section 2, I develop the argument to answer the second question: how does epistemological racism affect the African American psyche? Suggesting that epistemological racism affects the black psyche, mental processes that provide the basis for understanding oneself and behavior as an African American by imposing a way of being and knowing that influences African American identity construction and social interactions, sustaining the white supremacist social order. Here I bring my experiential knowledge to theory, employing CRT and education's emphasis on educational narratives by exploring my journey through higher education and my experience with identity crisis and self-knowledge to communicate lived experiences of epistemological racism effect on the African American psyche shared by African American students in Eurocentric education. Section 3 answers the third question: how can CRT in education and critical pedagogy aid African American students in comprehending their social identity and their interactions in and understanding of U.S. society? By exploring educators' attempts to challenge Eurocentric curricula with pedagogies that produce a critical consciousness, Africanization. I review CRT in education and 2 other critical pedagogies' potential to begin Africanization, awaken the black consciousness, and produce change agents. I conclude the literature review, summarizing the research questions and answers, proposing further research into the psychology of epistemological racism curriculum, and acknowledge that while Eurocentric curriculum is detrimental for African American students, white students are also affected. Thus, I conclude the literature review with the recognition that white students' experience with the Eurocentric curriculum instills a pseudo-superiority complex and white fragility when the status quo is challenged by non-whites. Thank you. This concludes Biologic Knowledge's first teach-in. Connect with us on Facebook to book services, follow on IG for content, and subscribe to the YouTube channel.